no one when they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old says, I want to put my hand in the ground and be an offensive lineman.
You're tuned in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, guiding your gridiron journey, none other than your host, former NFL lineman, Ross Tucker.
Oh, yeah, it is. But it's not just any Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It is a teaching tutorial Thursday. That means class is in session with the venerable Professor Greg Cosell from NFL Films University. Cannot wait to talk with Greg. We are actually going to talk about quarterbacks again this week, and I wanted to get some more thoughts on the college prospects. We talked a little bit last week about Carson Beck, but I wanted to ask Greg about Quinn Ewers as well as Shedeur Sanders, some of these other guys. But we interrupt this program to instead talk about offensive line, which is amazing because Greg and I saw each other in person. It's always fun when that happens because we talk to each other literally every week, the whole year. It's always fun to actually see Greg in person. Plus, there's some interesting offensive line news, and Hard Knocks offseason continues to be one of the most interesting Hard Knocks they've had in a long, long time. We are presented by DraftKings. Teams are reporting for camp. The whole Houston Texans are there. A lot of rookies are reporting. Things are starting to happen. It's Big Show time.
The Big Show.
All right, Greg, it was great to see you. It always is. We were going to talk about O-line, but I want to get in, we're going to about quarterbacks, but I want to talk about O-line. And so it's my first time attending. Your second year, right?
My second year at the OL Masterminds Summit, yes.
Okay. First of all, it's really, really cool and warranted and merited that you get invited. Because just so everybody knows, it's basically offensive linemen and offensive line coaches and Greg. And, maybe one or two other media folks or whatever. But it says a lot about Greg. Just kind of, if someone asked you about the event, I've been there now. So last year, I just asked you, but if somebody asked you about the event, what would sort of be your response? How would you describe it?
Well, I think basically it's a learning event. It's mostly for college offensive linemen, mostly. I mean, Alabama had their entire offensive line there. Clemson had their entire offensive line there. Oklahoma. So it's basically an event for college O-linemen because they bring in former and some present NFL offensive linemen, including Hall of Famers like Steve Hutchinson, Alan Faneca. This year, Jesse Sapolo was there. I know he'd been there in previous years. So you're getting an education, an offensive line education from some of the best who have ever done it. And I'm always trying to learn more and more, Ross, about offensive line because one of the things about offensive line play, as you know, and this is why it's so valuable to me, is offensive line is really a totally learned skill. There's a lot of unnatural movements that have to be taught and practiced and practiced and practiced. One of the things that Duke Manyweather, who's phenomenal, he runs it, and he started it 7 years ago. One of the things that he always says, which truly resonates with me, because obviously I wasn't a professional athlete, but I played sports through high school and college, is no one when they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old says, I want to put my hand in the ground and be an offensive lineman. No one says that. You want to do all those other cool things in sport, whatever sport it is you're playing. So, I find that as a starting point for me to be so fascinating. And I've been fortunate in my career, Ross. I've been able to go to training camps and stand 5 feet away from offensive line coaches as they teach the position and the nuance and the subtlety and detail and the difference of 5 inches between, steps, the difference in 3 inches between hand placement. Is people might look at it as, man, you're just fighting and you're trying to be physical and you're trying to knock a guy on the ground. It's so much more detailed, as you know, and you can talk to this so much in greater detail than I can, but I'm fascinated by the process.
It's what's really interesting, Greg, is first of all, you're right. I don't think many, if any, people grow up saying, I want to be an offensive lineman in the NFL. And a couple of things that are fascinating to me about that, most of the guys in the NFL, I would say it's more than 50% played a different position at some point in their life.
Yep.
They really did. And I can remember, Greg, I'll just go through it. First year playing football, 6th grade, I tried out for quarterback. They let me stay there for a little bit. Then they moved me to linebacker and O-line. Okay. 7th grade, wanted to play quarterback again. Now I had a little bit of movement skills, Greg, and our coach had watched me play basketball. He said, Tuck, I got a better idea for you. They moved me to fullback, which was actually pretty cool. I ran with the ball. I scored a touchdown. It wasn't quarterback, but it wasn't O-line either. I was fullback.
So you went from being Dan Marino to Tom Rathman in 1 year, huh?
Yes. Got to junior high in 8th grade. I had spent the whole summer with my plan to become Penn State's quarterback. And I got to 8th grade, wanted to be quarterback again. The problem was we had a guy that had already fully gone through puberty and was 5'11", $165, and fast, and he was better than me. He was. So I got moved to line again, and then that was kind of it for me. Then I'm in 9th grade, and I'm a pulling guard and a defensive end. But honestly, Greg, even when I was getting recruited, okay, Harvard and Princeton said I could play defensive end. William & Mary and Delaware gave me scholarships to play offensive line. Talking with those guys now, they said they were honest with me. They told me, you're probably not athletic enough to play D-line in our league. So that was actually a factor. I don't know how much of a factor, but it was a factor. I wanted Greg to sack a quarterback or make a tackle. That was cool. I wanted to hear my name called. I wanted those things. So I went to Princeton, and ironically, there was an injury. I ended up starting a couple games as a freshman defensive end. But then next thing I know, I got a lot bigger during Christmas break. I've told that story on these shows before. I came back, and they said, listen, you'll start either way, but we think you could really do something on offensive line. So then I permanently moved to offensive line spring of my freshman year of college. And what's so interesting to me about that, even though I had played it 4 years in high school, even just playing college offensive line in a zone blocking scheme with straight pass pro, right, was light years different than me playing offensive line in a wing tee.
Right.
Wing tee,
sure.
we only had waggle for passes. Every block was either an angle or you were pulling. So they moved me to offensive line. Pass blocking was very foreign to me, and frankly took me a while to kind of pick up. So what Duke says is right. Up until 9th grade, even though they had moved me to offensive line twice already, I was still trying to figure out how I could be the quarterback.
Well, the thing that really struck me as we sort of keep talking about this, and I learned this last year, my first year, is how much time they spend talking about your stance. Because I think when as a fan, which I was of offensive line play, I mean, I didn't know all the details years ago, no one thinks about your stance. It just seems like, okay, you're an offensive lineman, you get down in a 3-point stance. And of course, the game has changed where there's a lot more 2-point stance, certainly in high school and college, as you know. But still, in the NFL, you've got to get down in a 3-point stance. And they talked about that as your starting point, which didn't really surprise me, but I found so interesting. It's just like taking the snap when you're a quarterback, when you're under center. The really good offensive coaches start there, even though it seems like, oh, it's no big deal. Anybody can take a snap. And Steve Hutchinson spent so much time, and he was a guard, and guards are almost always in a 3-point stance. I don't want to, obviously the game's changed now, but he spent so much time talking to these college kids about stance and how you do that and how you're comfortable and how that relates to your first movement, which is such a critical movement. And this, you were an interior offensive lineman playing center and guard, how that's so critical because there's not much space between you and the defensive lineman, that your stance and your first step, your first movement is absolutely critical. And if that's not working properly, you're going to get beat right off the snap.
There's no question. And you know what's funny, Greg? I know Harbaugh made a comment this offseason, John Harbaugh, not Jim. Or no, Jim Harbaugh, not John. about offensive linemen being the only position that's not really dependent on other people. I guess I would argue it's probably the position that, unless you've been around it or coached with it, people are going to know the least about, right?
Yep.
Like, you might not know a lot about coverages, but you can see if they're playing zone or man, and you know they're trying to stop the guy from throwing the ball deep, right? Receivers are running, trying to get open. Running backs trying to get yards. Quarterbacks trying to throw the ball to the open guy. D linemen are trying to tackle the guy with the ball or go get the quarterback. Offensive line, people really don't know much about it. And I hear it, Greg.
No.
I mean, when I was a player, I heard it from coaches. And as a broadcaster now, I hear it A, from other broadcasters, but B, I hear it sometimes from coaches. You'd be amazed how many coordinators and head coaches still don't know as much about offensive line play as I kind of think they should.
No,
But
and you're
it's hard
right.
to be an expert in everything.
And like any position, but it's particularly so with O-line, and I'll give you an example in a sec, is there's the fundamentals and the techniques of actually playing your position, and I love learning that process. That's the starting point. But then, because 5 guys have to work together, and boy, did they harp on that in the 2 years I've been to the OL Masterminds Summit, that it's not just an individual position, even though you have to be totally buttoned up in all your individual techniques and fundamentals, but it's such a cohesiveness position. And I can tell you that when I'm doing a piece for the NFL matchup show and I'm trying to look at protections, sometimes I have to look at a play 10, 15 times, and I'm still not exactly certain what the protection call is based on the pressure that came, because obviously I'm not there. I'm not in their meeting rooms, and I'm not the center or the quarterback who's calling out the protection. And sometimes in the matchup show, a play that I want to do, Ross, I say I can't do it because I don't want to be wrong, and I can't quite figure out exactly what the protection is based on the front and the defensive front and the pressure. There's so much that goes into offensive line play that just sitting at home watching a game you have no idea about.
If you want to take things to the next level, drink some Labatt Blue Lights with your friends and live life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. You know what I realized, Greg? It's probably the second most thinking man's position, or I would say cerebrally stressed position.
Yep.
But also the second most physically aggressive position. So I would argue quarterbacks are still going to be at a little bit of a higher level than offensive line, although I think it's closer than people realize. And then defensive linemen, a lot of that is pure aggression, physicality. But I would put offensive line second on both of those spots, which is an interesting contrast, right? The thinking man plus you got to be, what do they call it? Intellectual brutality, right?
That's a great phrase.
The other thing I took away from it, Greg, and I knew this, but when I was in college, we would have a walkthrough, okay? A walkthrough, for those of you who don't know, is you just kind of walk through who you would block on the play. And you take a step and you're like, okay, I would get this guy or I would get that guy. My rookie year, Greg, I'm with the Washington Redskins at the time, 2001. Dave Zott. It was like his 12th year. He had been all pro.
I remember him.
He took every step, every hand placement in walkthrough incredibly serious. Now, he did it super slow, but he was conscious about left foot, right hand, left hand. I never did walkthrough the same after that, right? Like and if you noticed, Faneca and Hutchinson, all the guys, they all said that. They all said they took that part of it very seriously.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was probably really helpful for college kids that don't realize that.
No, you're so right. They talked about the walkthrough is not only for an individual standpoint, but where the 5-man communication and cohesion begins and becomes mastered, and that you must take that seriously. It's not just a day off or a period off, that you have to take that extremely seriously. The other thing, which I kind of knew, but I found really fascinating, and this was true of tackles and interior linemen, when you actually are dealing with who you have to block is they said everything starts with power. If you can't handle power, okay, from a defensive lineman, then you really can't play. Because everybody, when you watch tape like I do literally every day, and you look at pass rushers, what do we get excited about? All the cool moves, the guys that can put all these moves together and look really cool, that look like they're flexible and they're like Gumby. But every offensive lineman, and Teron Armstead really harped on this because he's another major part of the event. He's 33, probably going into his last year in the league this year, and he's been a really good player at left tackle. He harped on the fact that if you cannot deal with power as an offensive lineman, then you can't play.
It's such a good point because, all those fancy moves, Greg, and all those guys with the speed and everything, those moves don't affect you as much unless there's the threat of power.
Right.
If you can just stand up tall and just slide, you're good. But this isn't basketball. You can't take a charge.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like if you take a charge, your quarterback's dead.
Right.
So imagine that. It's like covering somebody in basketball, but there is no, hey, good job, he took a charge. No.
Right.
You can't do that. So the threat of power, which is why a lot of times early in a game, a D lineman will go speed to power just to make sure I got this, and I can bring this whenever I want. I can come and hit you in the mouth as hard as I can whenever you want. My big takeaway, Greg, and I think I already knew this, but every guy that got up there talked about their body type.
Yes.
And what works for their body type. And, I hopefully can attend next year, and hopefully I can make this point, because I said to Duke, I had 9 offensive line coaches in the NFL. Way too many of them, Greg, had a way of doing things, and this is the way you should do it. These are my techniques. And I look back on it now and think, well, that guy had 36-inch arms. I have 31-inch arms.
Right.
There's no way you should be telling us to do it the same way, Greg.
Well, it's funny you say that because I've talked to offensive linemen in my career, and like, for instance, Howard Mudd, like in Philadelphia, you remember when Howard Mudd was here. Howard Mudd teaches things way differently than Jeff Stoutland teaches things, and yet they're both great O-line coaches. There's different ways to do things, and you're 100% right. You're taught a certain way, but you have to feel comfortable in your own body with what you can do. Look, Ross, you and I have talked about this. You had short arms. You couldn't do things that a guard that had 34-inch arms could do just because your body wouldn't allow you to do it. So you had to do things differently.
Well, so I'll give one example, right? And this is getting a little bit nerdy, but this is what Greg and I do sometimes, right? If you're a guard with 34-inch arms, right, you can take a set and then punch or stab the D tackle. If I would take a set, he's going to affect my body before I affect his because his arms are longer.
Right.
It's almost like, there's a reason why when you watch a boxing match, they say the guy's reach, okay?
Yeah.
And the guy with the longer reach always wants to stay at a distance and just keep jabbing because he knows he can hit you where you can't hit him.
Tommy Hearns.
Yeah, what I wanted to do, Greg, is I wanted to jump set like Hutchinson did. I wanted to get into the D tackle's body as soon as, first of all, why am I going backwards at all? This guy is 335 pounds. I want to stop his momentum before it starts.
You want to minimize space, not create space.
Right, and I want to get into his body close. I don't want separation. Separation, I think, is his friend, not mine.
Well, it's funny you say that because even tackles who are on an island, they say that if they're facing a true speed to power conversion guy, if that's his game, they want to minimize the space. They do not want to give him a chance to build up velocity and speed where the power becomes a factor. So they want to minimize space. Whereas if they're dealing with a guy that's a move guy, all that, they want to create more space because Andrew Whitworth, who was not there this year but was there last year, he said he never had a problem playing against all the guys that are move guys because he said, eventually they got to come to me. So while they do all their moves, that doesn't affect me because eventually they got to come to me.
Well, and the other point I made, Greg, I know you mentioned after my talk was like, it's harder being a backup. than
I
being a
loved what
starter.
you talked about. I know we're running out of time, but I loved what you said about that. I loved it.
Because when you go in there, there's no, he didn't get the reps during practice this week. Or, I remember a Monday night game against the Eagles where I found out an hour and a half before the game, you're the backup at every position other than center. I was like, oh, really? Okay. Had not taken one rep at left tackle or right tackle all week. John Madden's there. It's Monday Night Football. It's Chris Samuels is blocking Hugh Douglas. I was like, oh, okay. Well, hopefully Chris stays healthy then. But that's real life in the NFL. Nowadays, I think most teams suit up 8, but these only suit up 7, and that was a disaster. It's Greg, we could do this. If we have any other thoughts, we can bring them out next week. Unbelievable stuff as always. We'll dive into the quarterback traits a little bit more because we didn't dive into that as much as I wanted to last week. But wanted to give you guys some flavor from our trip to the OL Masterminds event. Thank you so much, Greg, as always. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ross. That was fun.
Gosh, Greg is so awesome. You know what's not awesome? Letting friends overpay for wireless. Say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan and switch to Mint Mobile. I know, look, I was the same way. I get it. You're hesitant. You've been with blah, blah, blah for so many years. You don't want to switch. Do what I did. I got a SIM card for Mint Mobile. I put it in my old phone to make sure everything was good, everything checked out. It's perfect. $15 a month. And I've taken it to multiple places now to check and make sure they've got the nation's largest 5G network like they say they do. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/RTFP. That's mintmobile.com/RTFP. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/RTFP. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower, above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional tax fees and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
Tuck's Takes.
All right, Ross, there's a lot more talk about Hard Knocks this week, including Giants owner John Mara. He tells GM Joe Schoen that, quote, he'd have a tough time sleeping if Saquon goes to Philadelphia and that he's the most popular player we have by far.
You know what? This is really interesting, from a lot of different levels. And I'm going to make this, Jack, my Labatt take of the week because I got something to say about this. Presented by Labatt Blue Light, the pristine Canadian Pilsner. Enjoy your beers together so you can live life to the power of we. Always enjoy responsibly. Beer, Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. I actually give John Mara a lot of credit for letting Joe Schoen do what he wants to do. Because I can tell you from experience, both the teams I played on and having talked with coaches and executives after the fact, that there are definitely owners, a number of owners that would have said to Joe Schoen, we're keeping Saquon. You need to keep Saquon because of jersey sales, popularity, all those things. That happens more than I think a lot of fans realize. Even owners that you don't think are involved at all, at a minimum, most of them do what Mara did and said, okay, it would be tough for me if he went to Philly. It'd be tough. He's our most popular player by far. But I give Mara credit. He's letting Joe Schoen make the moves he wants to make, right or wrong.
And the other news, Broncos offensive guard Quinn Meinerz, he gets 4 years, $80 million with the Denver Broncos, $45 million of that guaranteed.
This hurts, Jack. This hurts. Try it again.
I'm not even gonna guess. If it's not Meinerz, I don't know. Miners, I don't know.
Miners.
That's a
Quinn
weird way to
Miners.
spell Miners.
I like Meinerz. That is unbelievable. It does inject some comedy in the show when you mispronounce a name. Our old producer, I think, used to do the research and look up the pronunciation guide if he wasn't sure.
Well, I do that for the most part. I slip one day. It's the off season. Sue me. You gonna give your opinion on this, or we?
I am. I'm so happy for him. Incredible story. D3 couldn't play his last year. Everybody knows the story. to get that kind of life-altering money. He's one of my favorite players in the NFL. He is looking to finish people. He's a difference maker. Kudos to Quinn Miners, and I'm thrilled that offensive linemen continue to get paid. Big week next week. Everybody will be in camp. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Make sure to also check out Even Money, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network on Samsung TV Plus, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
Shout out myfrontpagestory.com. Love when I get the email from you guys that you order one for a loved one. You know why? Because your loved one will love it. Pizza Boy Brewing, Sporticulture, HumanHeadNYC.com, BackOfficeScheduler.com.